Welcome back to Electrolysis Unplugged, the after-hours chat where we go beyond the probe. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Joanie. We're so excited for today's episode because we're giving you a teaser of our upcoming June seminar topic with Stephanie's talk about the science of filaments.
This is one of those topics that sounds technical, but once you understand it, it completely transforms your approach to electrolysis. We're talking about the filament. The probe, whatever you call it, it's one of those things you use every single time.
And yet, it's often the least understood tool in the kit. Let's change that.
Good evening, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
So we're excited for today's topic. Today's episode is a teaser on the upcoming June seminar. And more specifically, we're going to discuss Stephanie's topic, which is the science of filaments. And I wanted to start today with something Arthur Hinkle said that I always come back to. The probe is the most ignored piece of equipment in the room, but it defines the success of your work.
Oh, you know how much I love Hinkle. When we spend hours learning about modalities, settings, aftercare, but the actual tool that like a lot of our students, and I know that you understand this, they get the most kind of hung up on once they get the insertion is how to select a filament. And I think that is really important. I mean, it's an afterthought that needs to be on the forethought.
And historically, it's wild. The first electrolysis probes were modified sewing machine parts.
Yeah. I have some pretty cool old filaments in the museum. And I'll tell you sometimes, and a lot of those are getting put into my lecture so that you guys can kind of get a little teaser of, well, if you haven't been out to the museum, why not? But at the same time, like you get a teaser of what we've had literally put in people's follicles for the last how many years now? I'm not doing math right now. 150 years. It's insane to see it. Electrologists, it wasn't until like electrologists really started saying like, this doesn't fit this follicle that we started to like kind of
talk about the bruising that might have been happening.
Let's talk about the trauma. The only trauma we're okay to talk about without trauma dumping, right?
That's right.
Gosh. So yeah, I mean, that's when we started seeing it. So like, what do we have now, right?
Well, now we have tapered, we have insulated, and there's a lot of different types of insulated stuff out there. There's stainless steel, we have gold plating, so all these different options. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that people always use them well.
Well, I will tell you, even in my advanced classes that I teach for the practicing electrologists, the number one thing is people just don't understand which one to select. And I mean, you and I both know the panic that has happened in the last 5 years of these shortages with insulated filaments coming in and out. They're like, oh my God, what am I going to do?
Flexibility is your middle name here. Learn to use more than just the one thing. I've been in probe sales for a long time, and there are clients that buy one size, one type. That is it. Everything that it is the true definition of one size fits all in this case. Does it really fit? That's beside the point. Oh. But they are a one-trick pony.
Well, just before tonight's lecture, whatever this would be, the podcast, I was talking to the students. When you're brand spanking new, I do not want to see you leave school with one probe, like one type. You need to have a charcuterie board of options in front of you. And if you don't have that charcuterie board of options in front of you, you start to limit your efficacy as a technician.
That's right.
When we think about what we're doing within the insulated, the stainless steel, the gold, seeing the variations of insulation out there, seeing the variations of how the manufacturers compile the current probes, that kind of stuff, or construct, I should say. It's kind of crazy.
And there was an interesting conversation on social media this week that both you and I kind of, we always pick up these little tidbits because it's relevant and we discuss them. And I think that people enjoy hearing about it. But there was an electrologist who asked probes, needles, wire, filament. So all of these words interchangeable. And so that really got people talking.
Oh, yeah. I had jumped in with my little, what I talk to people about is a filament pierces the skin, a probe moves through the skin, and a filament conducts current. And this is how I explain it to my patients. This is how I explain it to my students. You'll hear me using all of them. Normally, when I'm using different terms, it's to describe brand than it is to describe what it's doing. But we honestly should be moving away from the word needle. And as much as, and y'all know, I mean, I've always talked about how much I love like the filaments that I use, but like when we utilize the word needle, we are not saying the correct thing in our work.
Mm,
It's so catchy, but it's also one of the things that if you start to change the way you talk about it, it will de-escalate tensions in consultations with
yeah.
people who have phobias of
Yeah.
needles.
Needle's a scary word, right?
Yeah.
And someone added that electrologists do not use needles. Technically speaking, it's a mini electrode.
Mhm.
So it can be called a probe, it can be called a wire, it can be called a filament. Usually most of those are going to be interchangeable.
Yeah. I saw this one person respond that a needle is sharp and it's used for piercing and always has a hole involved with it. And a probe is solid and it's meant to move through or test the space within. And I thought that was the move through and test the space within was one of those moments where I was like, that is exactly what we're doing because we are going into a blind spot off of our ability to feel where we have hangups
Mhm.
in our insertion technique.
And somebody did mention that they don't use the word needle, especially because people have phobias.
Yeah.
And so using the term probe tends to soften a little bit what the reality of what we're doing is. We're not really piercing, but at the same time, if you have a fear of needles, that they can be pretty scary for you.
Yeah.
Um,
It's even in piercing shops now, they no longer so like a piercing needle in a piercing shop typically does not have a gap in it because they're moving the tissue out of the way. In the old style, and now they have it where like you're basically removing a piece of it so that it heals as
mm,
a whole. And so it's like you have to start thinking about like what
like
is
a
it?
hole punch. Ouch.
Yeah, I'm like, ooh. Like
Mhm.
piercings, but I'm like, "Ooh, I don't know about that." So I think that it's important for us to really start reformatting how we talk about what we're utilizing to conduct current, because that's the bigger part about this. The probe is, or the filament is, a conductor of energy. And that
Mhm.
mini electrode that one commenter said, I was like, I love this. And because it is a great way to explain it. But then you also have people, I mean, when we were talking last week about like your elevator pitch, uh,
Mhm.
some people don't know what an electrode is, right? And so you have to start thinking about who am I talking to? Who's my audience, right? Because if I'm talking to a student, then you're going to get technical. But if I'm talking to the public, then I'm going to be able to describe something that you can then take and ingest and sit with, so that you have a better understanding of what I'm doing with you.
For sure. And it shows how language is evolving. So it's important to align with what we say and how we make our clients feel.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, how you set up that treatment room is part of the reason why you have success in that treatment room. If you're a
Mhm.
person that's sitting there kind of, I want to say, creating some spicy dialect during a session, it can translate to how the patient is relaxed on the table. And that, I mean, we've talked about that in just how we discuss hard moments when someone's in pain. But like, let's
Mhm.
get to that point of pain. We're talking about like, we need to be able to discuss what I'm going to do to you or do for you um, in a way that you're going to be able to walk away and be like, okay, that was done safely. So I think that's important.
For sure. So the insertion's an art, right? And a science, obviously, but the insertion is definitely art.
The insertions in art. So let's break this down. So inserting is about matching your filament to your follicle and its diameter, its length, its tip shape, but it's also about the angle in which you're going into that follicle. So it's important for you to understand that you, even if you have a great angle of insertion, if you then have a product that does not match what you're trying to get to, you then have a new hurdle to get past. So I know that years ago they had, and I updated mine recently, where it talks about the angles of insertion on the average area of the body where it's
Mhm.
non-distorted. But then I want people to go a step further and say, if I have non-distorted hairs in that area of the body, what type of hair am I working with, and understand that certain filaments, when the insertion is done well, will still feel a drag if it's not done picking the material that was best for the situation.
And sometimes if the probe's too thick, you get a drag. And by a drag, what we mean is like I kind of equate it to a tight squeeze. It
Mhm.
almost like you feel like you're perforating, but you're really not. It's just that the probe is just really stretching that follicle to the max and it's dragging along the walls, and that's kind of giving you a little bit of resistance. If the probe's too thin, and this is the number one um, misprobage that happens at the school, if I can make up a word in this moment here, where you kind of just pick a probe that's not really appropriate for what you're doing, students will tend to pick too small 9 times out of 10.
Oh, that's not
Scared, fear of using something too big for the follicle, right? Of poking. So the fear of poking means that most of them will go too small. But you go too small and your insertion is inadequate. You're not treating the full follicle. You're not reaching the full depth of the hair, because most probes will get longer as they get bigger. Not every company makes them the same, by the way. And it's important when you pick a brand to understand how they're manufactured.
yeah.
Also, did you ever hear, who was it? Was it Schuster that said a small probe is a hot probe, or did that
Oh, yeah.
originate from Hinkle?
I think it actually originated from Hinkle, if I remember correctly, but I think Schuster was the one that
Schuster used it too, but either way, there was this line, and I've always remembered it. A
a
small
man
probe is
with
a
a
hot probe.
mustache said it.
Huh?
A man with a mustache said it. That's all I gotta
Yeah.
say. Oh,
Some guy in the 1900s.
in the mid 1900s, but he was not wrong. I mean, if you think
Yeah.
about, especially when we start talking about the point effect and like working with an alternating current and that kind of stuff, if you think about, and then you add in like your megahertz playing into that, and that heating pattern that happens in there, how fast that heating pattern expands and how fast it grows. So, like when I say expands, I mean outwards, and when I say it grows, I mean upwards. I know that sounds silly because it's like
Yeah.
utilizing the same word in a different way, but like I think of like a person growing up and a person expanding outwards, you know? So
We just finished a full lecture on probes at the school, and there's this one image that I have that I've always loved that talks about how important probe choice is and probe size is, completely independent of the settings. And so sometimes, because it is a mini electrode and it's your conductor of your electrical current, you forget that it does affect how the coagulation pattern happens or how the lye is being produced. And I'll find this. You can keep going on your thought, but I definitely want to share this one image that will show you exactly that.
I think of, I know this sounds silly, but when we talk about insertion, um, you don't want to put jeans on right after you get out of the shower, okay? Because you're still a little damp, right? And jeans won't like on.
Mm.
Which is why like it's easier to have something a little bit more with a little bit more space. But more space means more movement, right? And more movement means that those little like your oscillating of that current is bouncing around and ricocheting within that at a rate that like becomes spicier. And I also think of like when you wear sweatpants on Black Friday versus wearing jeans on Black Friday, at some point, like, yes, they both might fit, but they're going to fit much differently. And so we have to think about like what we're selecting in that space, whether it's a one-piece probe is going to fit differently than a two-piece probe in a follicle. And while they might still be a size 2 filament, we're looking at how that 2 filaments going to work within your hands in that space. Oh, I love this image so much. It's one of my favorite ones.
Okay. So do you want to explain a little bit what's going on here?
So what we're seeing here is the growth that when we talked about like the shape of the coagulation that we're creating inside the follicle, you're seeing that growth and expansion of the heat on that probe. So if you look at an F1, the growth happens at a quicker rate because the filament itself has an ability to conduct that current faster. Think of it in terms of like a tiny frying pan for an egg, like an egg frying pan, versus the kind that you use for like cooking your chicken, right? A chicken breast takes longer to cook than an egg does, just because of the structure of it. But if you put an egg inside of a chicken pan and a chicken inside of an egg pan, they're not going to work the same way. I am such a food person, so apologize now for those who do not cook. But if I throw that in there and I put, for example, the chicken breast in my small pan, my egg frying pan, the heat that's happening is just going to sear the outside of it, but it will never really get to the point where it can cook the interior because I have already cooked and burnt the exterior of it. And now that's basically like a scab inside of there, right? And so we've already created the trauma at the area. It's going to have a harder time heating it. And then it's going to create bigger trauma in that space. But if I then put the egg inside that egg frying pan, it's going to cook at the same space. Now, if I put the egg inside of a chicken frying pan, right? Same thing happens. It's going to take a while for that white to turn white, right? And it's going to be an over easy egg for a real long time before it becomes anything that you want to eat. And that's happening because of how that pan heats the entirety of the area. So you always match your tools to the area in front of you, because if you're not matching them, then your heating pattern will never look like you see in this space here. So a 1 is going to get a lot hotter, a lot quicker than a 4 is going to. And that is because in itself, it's going to take longer for a 4 filament with its bigger diameter to heat than it was for a 1.
That's right. And I like to point out that this is all the same setting.
Yep.
And so if you're used to a machine that has a preset, then you can just think about a preset that you use. And the only thing that you're changing is the size of your probe. And it affects the heating pattern on your probe.
Mhm.
And so there's adjustments that have to be made depending on the probe. And so I like this sort of image too, just to
Well,
kind of show what it means when we're talking about size of probe and intensities.
oh yeah. Well, I mean, when we talk about like how that power is distributed, we think about it in terms of, and let's think about thermolysis in this space. And we can definitely go down the galvanic route too, because there's importance in that as well. But in your thermolysis world, if I am using a 6.78 megahertz to a 27.12 megahertz machine, okay, you're going to have a different impact of that heating pattern as well. So let's mix up. Okay, so I have a 6.78 machine, a 13.56, and a 27.12. I've got 90% on all 3 machines. And I've got a size 3 on all 3 machines, size 3 filament on all machines. Every one of those is going to have a different heating pattern. And that 90% is going to act differently from 6 to 13 to 27, as well as what that filament was doing within that space. Because on a 6.78, I'm probably going to be pushing myself towards doing a lower intensity alternating current for a longer timing than I am going to be in a 27.12. Now, can I kill a hair in all of them? Sure. I can absolutely kill the hair in all of them. But what am I choosing my tool for? And that's important to start thinking about. And so if your filament is like, it's like the cherry on top in these scenarios, because you can set everything else up, but if you select the wrong filament, everything that your machine says on the screen on its interface pretty much doesn't matter at that point. It's not actually reflected on what the filament's doing.
We had the situation at school today. I had a student working on a chest and she was using a size 2TH. They always go for the 2THs. By the way, ProTech's about to have a little bit of a back order on these things, so you better jump on those. But I go by and I ask, how's it going? She's like, yeah, not so good, you know. So I look and it's definitely a 3TH type of hair. And so I go back, I change the probe. I say, you're going to have better luck with this. And we didn't really change anything else, but she puts in a new probe and all of a sudden, no problems.
like butter.
Yep. I mean,
Yep.
it's just about distribution of that intensity. You need to think about surface area of your probe, and that's a fairly big variable when it comes to success with the extractions for sure.
Oh yeah. I mean, you and I were talking about this before everybody came on, because you were surprised that I put this in my notes.
Mhm.
But I had, and this is not the first time it's happened, but this is the one that kind of sits with me the most, is I had an established electrologist that was a student to me, right? Whose insertions were off. Okay. And it wasn't that her insertions were off, it's that she was feeling something and she couldn't use, I don't want to say her words, she couldn't find the words to figure out what was wrong. And so a lot of times what'll happen is like I'll kind of look and I'm like, okay, I see where you're struggling and that kind of stuff. I went to go fill the filament, and she was using a handmade filament. Okay, the person that, and it's an older company that's no longer around. would make the filaments in um, a non-factory setting. I don't really know what the factory looked like, but it was a non-factory setting. And I actually really like the probes for galvanic typically, but not necessarily for thermolysis. And there was a variation on the exterior of the probe and their insulating process that you could feel where it was getting, there was like a bit of like a hand milled kind of a scruffy spot,
There was like a little speed bump.
little speed bump. And you could, especially when you do your insertions, like when you're practicing and you're like, is it me? Am I the problem kind of thing? You're trying to kind of figure it, slow yourself down and see if, like, once you get your angles in different directions, that kind of stuff, see if it happens on every type of hair you encounter. Because if it happens on every type of hair you encounter, there's going to be some things that you have to start asking yourself, like, because that to me indicates two things. Either there's something wrong with the probe or there's something wrong with me, right? Um, but I would like to see what my heating pattern is looking like on the skin to know whether or not it's me and my insertion depths and angles. Then if it's on the filament, then I would notice that my irritation around the area that I'm working would look a little different. So it turned out that she was just using a probe that was not ideal. And it happens even in machine manufacturing. And I know that a lot of people probably listening later on that have been doing this a while. A few years ago, there was one of the old companies had the milling machine break, and you could see that there was something different. Like you couldn't see it with your eyes, but you could see it with your work. And there is something that happens when you start seeing that recurring. You have to ask yourself, what went down. I see something popped up into the chat, and I don't want to.
It was a question about, is the energy level too high if the inner root sheath is getting stuck to the probe? Usually clean it with alcohol bath and continue if it happens. My answer to that is if it happens once or twice, no big deal. If it happens every time you're zapping the hair, then yes.
Yep, exactly. I had the same answer, because the thing is like, you're gonna, not all the hairs there are they going to be the same. So you're going to come a couple of them. But if it's more than, say, 5% of what your area worked in is, then I would start to ask myself, why am I having more than 5% being a negative reaction?
And in the spirit of talking about filaments, when we're talking about how we could fix this just with looking at the probe usage, then you have to think about increasing your surface area so that you can reduce the intensity delivered. And you can do that one of two ways. You can either decrease the amount of insulation. So you go from a probe that is very insulated to less insulated. So if you're talking about Protex, that would be going from a TH to a BL. Or if you're talking about ballets, then it could be going from an insulated to a stainless steel or gold plated, right? So some sort of non-insulated probe, or you go up a size. That's another way.
Yeah. I mean, as a galvanic user, like, you're very welcome, hon. As a galvanic user, it's one of those things that a lot of times people don't realize. I'm trying to create the surface area needed to create those light bubbles along the area so I can get enough destruction for the hairs that I'm in that area. So if I'm not matching my filament to that time, what I'm creating is not actually possible, because I did not have all parts of the necessary elements of that treatment. So recently, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot in the last year, when we had ballets go on back order for insulated, as distributors, we were like, yes, we understand how much of a pain in the butt this is. And then now it's happening with Abyss, and now it's happening with Protex. So it's like it happens across the board with everybody. But when that happened, a lot of people looked at me and they're like, well, now what do I do? Because so many of us do a lot of thermolysis as our starting points. And it's like, take a moment, reduce your intensity by half, and then find your new working point within a new material. Can it be done? Sure. Whenever we talk about material usage and when it comes to a filament, the insulation, while important, okay, because obviously insulation does create a beautiful safety net for us.
Yeah. It's not fail-proof.
It's not fail-proof. And in fact, sometimes I see people overuse insulation to compensate for poor insertions, for poor depth, for poor displacement. And what that tells me is we need to get to feel more comfortable with working within different materials. A gold and a stainless probe can be done with thermolysis. What does that look like? My point effect now doesn't look as narrow and sharp, right? It now has a bigger impact. And I would say that it's important for you to go, okay, like if I am dealing with I have to do thermolysis because this person has a contraindication, or I have to do thermolysis because I'm doing a big clearance on this first thing. If I have that much exposed filament, reduce your intensity and stop doing clearances. This is when feathering takes over. The more heat I'm putting behind on the skin and leaving there, the more thermal relaxation time I'm going to need in between your sessions, because I didn't protect you with a product. I protected you with my knowledge, right? And so my knowledge then has to be the compensator there.
Today, we want to shine some light on some of our amazing partners who are helping shape the future of electrology education, services, distribution, and so much more. We're thrilled to have such amazing partners and supporters. Whether you're just starting out or a seasoned professional, these vendors and schools have what you need to succeed. Zapmaster Electrology is located in the Pacific Northwest in Centralia, Washington. Stephanie Shields and her Zaplings lead the charge with award-winning education. Whether you're just starting out or looking to deepen your expertise, Zapmaster offers hands-on training, online theory courses, and so much more. And don't forget their distribution center. Led by Michael Shields, this is your one-stop shop for high-quality tools, products in electrology, aesthetics, laser hair removal, and so much more. Ready to enhance your practice? Visit thezapmaster.com. That is thezapmaster.com, and discover the resources awaiting for you. Elevate your practice with Silhouette Tone. Known worldwide for their advanced equipment and sleek designs, from epilators to treatment tables, lasers, and more, they provide a gold standard in comfort and performance. Your clients deserve the best, and the Silhouette Tone delivers. Head over to silhouettetone.us to learn more. That's Silhouette Tone, SILHOUETTONE.us to learn more. The North American distributor of ballet needles and Instantronics is none other than Synoptic Products. Every electrologist knows that precision matters. Ballet needles are designed for just that, offering unparalleled accuracy and comfort for both the practitioner and the patient. Instantronics is known for the smoothest hair removal experience, and distributors who are enthusiastically moving towards innovative experiences with their new ownership under Dr. Sarah Paisner. Instantronics, formerly known as Instantron, is making strides towards innovative experiences in electrology epilators. You can ensure that your practice not only remains clean, safe, and compliant, but on the leading edge of technology and innovation. A must-have for every electrology clinic. Visit synopticproducts.com to learn more.
Hello, electrologists. Hazel Bloom with Kiwi Fruit Coaching here. If you're unfamiliar with the name, you can listen to episode 16 of this here podcast to find out a lot more about me. But long and short of it is, I'm an online queer life coach for the queer community and its allies, and I'm also available as a resource for electrologists if you have any questions about interacting with the trans community, how to provide gender-affirming care. I've had some really insightful conversations with some listeners so far, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help. My website is kiwifruitcoaching.com, or you can email me directly, hazel@kiwifruitcoaching.com. Thank you for providing gender-affirming care. You're heroes.
Thanks for tuning in to Electrolysis Unplugged. Be sure to check out our amazing sponsors for the best in electrology tools, training, technology, and so much more. Now, back to the show.
So let's talk a little bit about tapers. So tapered probes are pretty much a game changer, especially with blend or high frequency work. And so when we're talking about tapers, we're talking about the angle that the tip comes at, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So when you look at a filament and it goes basically, whether it's one piece or two piece, from the point that the filament is the exact same diameter, okay, down to the tip of the probe is the area in which we're talking about in taper. Yes, on a one piece probe, you have multiple taper points, right? But taper exists on both spaces. And that rounded edge that we now see within filaments was a game changer for conducting current. if you have gotten a chance to listen to Dr. Paisner's topic about how current plays on filaments, there's a lot of stuff that is still very unstudied in the world of electrology, which, hello, research project for you and I. But like, I think that one of the things that has kind of been misunderstood for a long time is how energy flows along a conductor. And that taper gave us an opportunity for energy to flow at a point that was more direct, a point that was more accurate than what we saw in the past. We also saw that like it went from, because like a bulbous probe, it was good for galvanic in theory. And I definitely saw a difference when we were using that for multi back in the day, when Mike Roy was still around. But you don't really ever see it within thermolysis. So it wasn't completely irrelevant to half of the
Well, it does the opposite of what you want the current to do with thermolysis. You want a point effect with thermolysis, and a bulbous probe would completely negate that. Yeah. So it depends on your technique, but it was, definitely very different.
Hinkle had that really cool egg white experiment. And I love the one that you've done at like lectures and that kind of stuff too. I probably should incorporate that into this. There's still time. But I think that it's really cool about like when you use the two different types of filaments into the egg whites and watching how those heating patterns expand. It was really neat. And actually the one picture that we showed a few minutes ago of showing how that heat pattern changes, that's egg white suspension, I believe, in that one as well.
Yep.
And it just goes to show you what cooking looks like when you work with different size filaments and what the shape it does.
That's right.
The tapered filament in this scenario, it delays the heat reaching the surface by giving us that opportunity for that direct.
To concentrate the energy at the tip. It saves the epidermis, so that's definitely a plus. And it lets you work deeper without overtreating the top layer.
Oh yeah. For people with like terminal growth, especially trans feminine folks working through gender affirming care, and PCOS patients, same deal. Like we're working with skin that we're trying to soften and feminize. And by going too aggressive in that space, I mean, you're then starting to like destroy the skin's ability to like balance itself out with its moisture and its oil production and that kind of stuff. And so I feel like the tapered probes, the insulated probes that we've had in current years have been real lifesavers for those scenarios alone.
For sure. And not every client needs the same probe, right? So from brows to facial hair, different, those can be totally different zones and totally different sizes. Insulations and the types of things that you might pick would be completely different for both of these types of cases.
Oh yeah. Well, different zones, right? Different zones require different things. I will say, and I would love to see this get changed on a lot of the epilators out there. Obviously, I don't make epilators, and so I just smile and nod that it's not there yet by itself. But I'm never a person that goes it by gender. I go by what the type of hair is. And I think that when you're looking at selecting your filament, you're not looking at it, selecting it based on gender either. It's like one of those ones where I understand what they were trying to do. It's pretty on the outside of a machine. It's cool. But even if I say leg, there are legs out there that have peach fuzz, the vellus hair. And there are legs out there that have, those deeply rooted in the pits of hell terminal leg hairs as well, especially that inner thigh area. I mean, you're not going to have the same looking leg. And the more hormone influence, and people forget that like hormones, the influence of hormones are not specified to one gender or one sex, I should say. They're specified to what the sex or hormones are doing in that space, but that can be on any person. And many of our patients, those assigned female at birth with PCOS, no matter their gender presentation, when their body shifts in how the hormones are received, those hairs start to act as though they were not their assigned at birth sex. And so getting to know how to select a filament based on the same way you select your hair caliber or density is probably going to be a more important factor in that space. So matching the probe to the person, it's absolutely fine to use the non-insulated probes. For eyebrow sculpting, however, is that what I'm going to be doing? Probably not. In most cases, because it's usually for my deeper hairs. I would say like utilizing a tapered insulated probe in this space is going to be like chef's kiss in that zone. I think that if we can start to understand that to our core, that's when we start to change our treatment rooms.
There's a good question here in the chat. Do you use two different size probes in one session to accommodate caliber size for different hairs in the same area?
Okay.
So like if we're clearing a chin and we have two different size hairs, do we change probe size?
So that's actually a great question because I know that I have, when we talked about the body zone area too, that was another one. And I can kind of incorporate this into both parts, both bullet points. So do I need to change it or can I change it? Yes. In the past, I would absorb the cost of the filament and add in an additional filament if I was going more aggressive on my clearance patterns. Times have changed. And I would say that I now talk to clients about focusing on the same caliber or density size hair in that session, see how the skin's reacting, and if they would like to revisit a smaller size filament for a smaller size hair and keep going because we are doing longer on that, then I would say that would be an accrued additional cost to their treatment by switching that out. And I know that it seems small, but right now, with everything that's happening in our industry, I think that it's smarter for us to do this because it is something we are giving a more customized treatment in that space. And so it's something that I've talked to my staff about. It's something that I think about kind of on the regular. And I would say that, yes, I would change it out. Yes, I would keep going, but I would also ask them, are they okay with me doing this? Because I'd prefer to have two different sessions and see them for two different style hairs on two different style days and it just be part of that than to change everything out because now I'm having to think about it outside of what I was already focused on. I know that sounds extra, but
I mean, to me, you pay for the cost of that probe with the extra time that you're there working on those fine hairs too. So, in a way you're cutting the session short
if
by,
I was, if I was, if like what you're saying, I'm sorry, I'm like, my brain was like that. Absolutely. Because if it's cutting the session short and I'm losing out, then that I would eat that cost during that time frame.
Yeah.
Right? But if I'm going over, that cost of the overage is my filament. Like that's what that is in that moment in my head.
There's also, it should be mentioned that they need to be drastically different size hairs for me to change probes.
Heck
So
yes, that's taper.
you can squeeze a size 3 into some pretty small hairs. The skin and the pore is stretchable.
Yes.
So, it would have to be like I'm going from a size 4 to a size 1. It has to be like that. Otherwise, I'm not going to bother. The probe that I have on is the one I'm using. I matched the bigger size hairs because that's obviously the biggest concern. And most of the time, that same probe can be used on the smaller hairs, no problem.
Agreed. And I would say that that is the other part of this is like, would I do it? Sure. But I also know, and I know how hard it is as a new technician to slow yourself down and say, I can get into this follicle. Because there's a thing that happens with new technicians more where they start panicking because they can't get into the follicle because they're getting nervous about that tension that they're feeling as they enter a smaller size follicle with a larger size probe. It is more an issue if you go from a small size hair to a large size hair. So like you'd ask, like, would I go from a bikini to an eyebrow and vice versa? I would say, and use the same size filament. If I start out from a bikini, I'm going to get a new filament. Okay. If I go up to your face, hygiene, right? Okay. Yeah. That's the big thing there. But if I'm going from your eyebrow to your pubic, I'm not going to get a new size probe unless I need, if it's like I was one up here and a 4 down there, yeah, I would need to do that. But it's the same concept as like you can get into that, but you need to match it to the larger size hair because once again, remember that small probe is substantially hotter.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to size down, do not size down the filament and then go back to working those big behemoth of hairs because those ones are going to not conduct the current the way you want it to.
Something that I've started saying recently, because I feel like I would always say match the size of the probe to the size of the hair, but
Mhm.
then they would always pick small probes. And then I would take a hair out, show them the size of the root, show them how deep the root is, and then explain that the size of the probe was too small. But they're looking at the outside, which tends to taper, right? A new baby
Yep.
hair. And
Yep.
so I started saying match the size of the probe to the root of the hair.
Oh, yeah,
Just so
totally.
that you can match it, because the root of the hair is always going to be thicker and wider on an anagen than it is on the outside, unless the hair is, in late anagen and it's 2 inches long.
Right.
But most of the time, you're not thinking about the root of the hair so much as you're thinking about the outside. And when they go too small, they're not reaching the dermal papilla. And so your efficacy as an electrologist just dropped because you're not even treating the follicle completely.
Absolutely. I mean, using a size 2 on a size 4 hair, you barely are getting to the stem cell area of that size 4 hair. I mean, if you're getting there, and the amount of current that you have to get that to release, you're plucking that hair.
Mhm. That's right.
And so it's hard to look at those moments and be like, oh, like I I will listen to a new technician and say, okay, like we can try a smaller one and see if you get in there easier, right? But
Mhm.
at the same time, understand that when I say that it's going to be a hot probe in there, that they need to make adjustments, and I come over and those adjustments have not been made, I'm looking at them going like, this is why we are doing this space. And that's why when someone comes in with a little pinpoint scabbing, and I'm like, okay, so I'm looking at terminal hair growth. What size probe did you use? I used a size 2. And I'm like, well, no kidding. Now all my heat was at the surface in that space. And it just stinks to see it.
Yeah.
And then if you're using something if you're in like a flash modality and you're not in a deeply rooted hair and you're in an IBL probe versus an ITH, you're going to have a much different look again. And so you have to start looking at how it's hard not to go into my full lecture, Joanie, when you're like, do you want to do a
I
teaser?
know. No,
And
it's
it's
just a
like,
teaser. You have to keep it brief.
I'm like, chill.
So let's go on to the next topic and let's talk a little bit about the then versus now. And I have another slide that I want to pull up as we're discussing this because I think that it's
The
so
is it the spicy looking
the
one?
joys of the 80s and 90s and prior when it came to probe manufacturing. We kind of talked a little bit about some of these already.
Mhm.
And so you have some of the bulbous, right? You can see where the tip of the probe is actually wider than
Mhm.
the shank of the probe. You have some that have these metacrylic, which is kind of like a plastic insulation on it. You have
Mhm.
one that is like a pencil taper, like extreme taper, almost
Yeah.
very, very pointy. And what's also important, which is the thing that you were talking about your student that was the electrologist, about the thing that caught, right?
Yes.
I pictured the one with the metacrylic plastic on it because that is something that would be like a speed bump on a
Yep.
probe, right? Trying to insert in there. Another thing with the hand milled stuff is the roughness of the metals, and
Mhm.
those were just horrible for infection control. All these little grooves that you have in the probe were areas where you could deposit bacteria, and bacteria could definitely proliferate there.
Oh, it was the one that's like what the fifth one in that has the metacrylic. Uh,
Hmm.
Looking at that, I'm just like, I understand how that insulation happens. But I also understand very quickly that you would feel that if you were taking the time that you should be to do your insertions, you would feel that on every insertion. I also that what is that? The seventh one, the uniprobe. Yep, yep, that baddie right there. Uniprobes. I mean, it's a cool concept. But
Hmm.
it's a firm probe.
Yeah.
Because that plastic is like it holds on, and so if you're someone that's trying to do speed electrolysis and using a uniprobe, you're most likely going to be kind of harpooning the patient over and over again because it's not going to give.
Fun.
Um,
Yeah,
we don't do that. We only harpoon things that we're going to eat in the ocean.
that's right. That's right.
So we do not do that with people. Uh,
One thing that was always like interesting to me is these metacrylic probes. They were really good galvanic probes as far as the insulation, but this plastic would melt with flash high frequency. And so
Mhm.
could you imagine you're working along and all of a sudden you're just leaving behind this plastic, little microplastics, right? Infused right into your follicle.
Right into the follicle.
Fun
Well, I know
times.
that like when I started talking to years ago, Mike Roy was the owner of Laurier Probes up until maybe, oh gosh, I want to say he passed away in like 2018, 2019, somewhere in that range. And he and I would always talk shop because of being a multi-needle epilator operator,
Hmm.
about the shapes of probes and that kind of stuff. And one of the big things I talked about was that if I was doing high frequency, that you would see after an all day session pieces of the high frequency on. It was like getting just broken down. Um, and it was, however, the insulation was, it was inconsistent for a lot of the probes that were out there at that time. But I never saw it with the galvanic, which
Hmm.
was interesting
Well,
because
most likely it was the heat reaction.
it
It
was.
couldn't have been much anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just basically breaking it down, turning it into little
Yeah.
pieces of like
Little
broken
flecks.
plastic. Yeah, little flecks. And it
Mm.
was something that on my all day sessions I would recognize with my patients that were flying in from, all over the world for these marathon sessions. And, you do one filament for as much of the day as you could, and then you switch it out later. Well, when we talked about stuff getting stuck on the filament earlier, um, what would happen is if you were using, and I don't remember, this is years ago now, I don't remember which probes I was using at the time, but you would have this breakdown of the probe that would happen is where you can see the insulation just slowly getting weaker in certain
Mm.
points where now if I had an insulated probe and I lost insulation midway, I now had 2 point effects possibly happening in that space. And so, I mean, in theory, could that be kind of cool for like the dermal papilla area as well as the bulge to have like boop boop? Maybe. I mean, like, but at the same time, that seems like that's just me
But
conceding
you
one.
know what's funny is that there are 2 point effects when you use an insulated probe.
Yes.
And I have another image of that because that's an interesting one too, is you have a point effect where the insulation stops and then at the tip of the probe, the proper tip of the probe.
Yes. And also, just so you guys know, I'm really happy that she is showing you on her slides because I don't want to give out my. It's like
Yeah, no, those are going to be for trying to find my.
I'm the person that if I know that you have a surprise that you want, if I buy your surprise gift before the day of giving it to you, you will end up seeing your surprise beforehand. So,
Can't keep a secret.
this is why it's on her lecture slides, not mine.
That's right. So this one, let's make it. Oopsies. We saw that one already. So this one actually shows two things, right? One is you're seeing kind of the development of that characteristic teardrop, but what you're seeing is the 2 point effect. So it's kind of like it took time, what's it called? Time lapse?
Time
Like
lapse.
a very quick time lapse images. And so you can see as it goes through this little, trying to get my laser pointer. There we go. There's a point effect here and there's a point effect here. And so depending on like if you had a BL probe and technically the top part here was where the bulge is, then you would be treating that first too. But eventually you can see that it does this here. This, by the way, is a blowout. And as you can see, it's as if no insulation exists on this probe. The current doesn't conduct through steam, which is what's happening here, and it will find a place to exit, even if there is a micro amount of Teflon or whatever insulating material is on that probe. It will find a way out no matter what.
Your follicle becomes a tea kettle when that happens,
Mhm.
and that's why your client's able to hear it. And like whenever I first understood that concept, I just, I just thought that sometimes you hear it when I was a new electrologist. And I think that this is why it's important to do it, advanced electrology classes and that kind of stuff, is to understand that like we shouldn't be hearing crackling like that. It's not the bacon fry yet.
Mhm.
Okay. Yet it can be the next pulse. But you're hearing that happen because it just got rid of all of the remaining moisture in that area by turning you into a little teapot, giving them that little sound. And usually
Mhm.
when you hear it, the next snap that's when you have now infused your filament to the sidewalls of the follicle. And that's when you're like, why is it stuck? And we're saying, well, you're stuck to all of that interior of that
Yeah,
hair.
now you gotta scrape that egg off your pan,
Oh gosh, what a painful concept. Uh,
right?
we had, bless bless him. My spouse was my first model when I first started electrolysis, but he also, when we first opened the school and we did have many models coming in, he would have his arms worked on, and he had that happen to one of his forearm hairs, where first zap was very shallow. I heard, and I was like, make sure you get yourself down there. Next zap, uh, that skin was cooked to his to that filament,
Probe stuck inside.
was stuck inside. And when they removed it, he had like nerve numbness because of how
Oh, wow.
on that
That was
spot.
intense.
It was intense. And I was like, this,
Yeah,
like when I say to
yeah.
do the things I say,
You
and
know, that's what a school's for.
yeah,
It's I kinda tell the students sometimes you're gonna wear your first day for a month
yeah, oh
because
yeah,
they start their first day on themselves, and that's where they do the most damage, and it's
yep,
just you'll heal, but it's funny. And then we learn why did this happen, and hopefully, it sinks in, you learn the lesson, and then you don't do it again.
absolutely. That first, I would say 2 weeks of school uh,
Mhm.
is 2 weeks of, oh my gosh, what did I get myself in for? Uh, and aside from the business classes and that kind of stuff, it is kind of those funny moments where you're just like, well, you just changed your entire career and the way you have to think about anything that you've done previous. Because unless you were in aesthetics as a master esthetician doing advanced treatments and that kind of stuff, the chances that you've ever thought the way an electrologist thinks um,
Mm.
prior to becoming an electrologist is pretty small. So,
So before we wrap up for today, we wanted to share a few great questions that came up recently through our membership.
yep. So one listener asked for probes, has there been scientific studies done confirming or not that if you bend probes, it will affect current or treatment? Um, I will say that it's a great question. Some teachers will say that bending probes is like compromises the current flow. But I will say that Mike Bono's book shows how to bend them properly. Um, and I feel like this might be like a technique versus manufacturer tolerance kind of thing.
Mhm.
I want to say that if you are bending a probe, and I'm sure y'all can see my finger in this moment, I do not want to see you take a forcep to the edge of your little tiny probe and bend it. Okay. But I will say on your gloved finger, if you were to take your filament and kind of curve it like this so that you're not puncturing yourself, right? So you're just kind of giving it a smooth curve. That is a easier bend to do than anything else. And I would say anything that you bend should be bent off of a smooth, soft, pliable surface in those times.
Yeah, and I mean these questions come up, and why is it even that this instructor was saying this to the student? Well, because there's, I know that Sarah's is a big one that talks about it. That anytime you are bending a probe, you're creating a new point effect, and or an area where the electrons can just kind of fly off that wire. And so what ends up making it to the tip of your probe is going to be less intense than it would have been if you kept the probe straight.
Mhm.
Now, I had a student actually ask me about this. I think it was last week, and my response is it's simple. Like I understand what the thinking is behind it. My thing is that in practice, I don't see that happening.
Correct. And when you don't see it happening in practice, and this is why it is so important for us to like talk as electrologists. Um, it is more energy loss if I miss your follicle because
Hmm.
of improper technique getting into that follicle and hitting the surface than ever if I bend that probe just a little bit. In fact, in every setting that you have, it's not that you have the perfect setting. You found a good range to work within when you are zapping a hair. Now,
Hmm.
even your presets, the presets aren't the only thing you should ever be using for the hair that you selected in front of you because it's all a range, right? When you and I talk about like well, Apples or Silhouette Tone, just because of our distribution companies. And I'm going from, different types of filaments. I'm going for different types of people. I'm selecting different types of ranges. They talk about energy level. So EL on an Apples, UE energy unit or units of energy, sorry, on Silhouette Tone. Either way, it's still the same thing. It's a formula for figuring out how long you need to be in and how that energy is going to distribute. It's the answer to your formula. Okay. Either way, you have a range. When I first started out working with Apples, I had come off of my Gentronics, and my Gentronics had presets on it as well. The only Gentronics that didn't was my very first ones that were like knobs. But even then, there was pieces of paper that would go whenever you would buy a machine that recommended what you should be sitting within on your knob, on your interface that's computerized now. And I think that's important to note that like those presets are prime conditions if everything is set correctly for moisture gradient of the skin, for age of the hair, for size of the hair, and even then it's still a window. My Apples up to 250 for finer hair, up to 200, let's say like 200 to 400 for, and this is my current settings. When I was back in Arizona, it had to be a little bit different. 2 to 400 for an accelerated vellus hair, 300 and above for terminal hair. But y'all know that hairs aren't just 3 sizes. And so that's important to note, that when you're setting your levels up, your filament, the shape of that filament, the bend of that filament, the angle of your insertion, all of that plays into how successful of a day you're going to have.
Right. We had another good question. Would it be possible to offer multi-size probe packs?
Oh my gosh.
That'd be great, right?
That was so good. Whenever I go to convention and Ballet has that one that's a sample pack, I get all excited because it's like,
that's what I was going to say. Those are called sample packs, and companies will give them to you at trade shows.
Yes, we have them. It's
otherwise, I mean, you go through probes, like I don't know that I would need to, unless it's the less used. I think the size that I use the least is a size 5.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I feel like 4 is kind of like 3 and 4 is kind of like the 2 big ones. 2 on my vellus hair people. 1, I have to use the least, and 5 I use the least. I just told the students this today. I said, if you are getting into your practice, do not buy 10 packs of size 3 insulated probes. Like, don't do it. Will you use them? Sure, you'll use them. Will you use them before the expiration? Hopefully, if you're busy enough. Okay. But that is 10 packs of 50. Wait, how many are sold in a ProTech?
30.
30. Okay. So between 300 and 500 probes, as a new technician, should have more of an assortment than if I bought 10 packs of 30 or 10 packs of 50. That's how I'm getting those numbers, right? You should have more in assortment. And it should be reflective of the people you're trying to pull in the door, right? If you're planning on having everybody in your door, then I would say every filament should come in the door. If you plan on only working with terminal hair growth, understand that you should be getting size up a little bit more. If you plan on only being a peach fuzz technician, size it down more.
Downsize.
Yeah. Yep. So that's what we mean by that. But multi packs. I'd love to see the same thing for multi-needle, but like I digress. Mike had these really cool plastic containers. You couldn't sterilize them.
I remember those. Yeah.
Oh, they were so good. They were so good. I love them so much, but they're gone. So, okay. So another practical one. When moving into different areas of the body, should a new probe be used? Like I said before, if by chance you are working in an area that tends to be a little bit more sweaty or just traditionally a little bit more dirty, everywhere in our body needs to be clean, but I would say change it. So if you're going to an underarm to an upper lip, probably change it. Groin to an upper lip, change it as well. If it's any other direction, I'd say it's fine. But that's just me being like a cootie queen.
No, I agree. So I guess hopefully this was good and you guys will walk away with a little bit of a deeper understanding of what the tiny probe really is doing and how to make it work for you. And this was a little bit of a teaser also for what Stephanie's really going to dive into in June.
But we're in June.
I know, right? So for the seminar, June 23rd, my office looks like a bomb went off and there's so much stuff everywhere. I think I have to walk over boxes to go in. So now it looks really bad. If anybody has to come in my office, I'm embarrassed. But all that is to say that we're hoping that this is going to be a great event. And I hope that some of you at least are going to come and join us in Las Vegas. But if not, hopefully we'll see you online.
On the virtual, yeah, I'm super excited for Vegas. And I am very glad that I did not give away most of my lecture because I was like, we'll do this again for Joanie next week and see how she does with it.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Yeah, we'll tease on my topic next week.
Very cool. All right. Awesome humans. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.
Same day, same time.
Follow us on Instagram at Electrology Coalition.
Subscribe to Electrolysis Unplugged and leave us a review. It helps other electrologists find us.
And if you're a visual learner or you love the discussion, our Tuesday mentorship hour is the perfect place to keep growing your skills.
We'll keep sharing episodes that reflect your questions, your curiosities, and the evolution of our language and our practice.
Until next time.